The pages of history are littered with the terrible deeds of great conquerors, their legacies penned in the blood of their fallen enemies. Yet of all the fearsome warlords who looted, burnt, and killed their way to greatness and infamy, one of the most dreaded was Timur, a man who built a massive empire on the bones of millions of victims and left dozens of once flourishing cities as smouldering, depopulated ruins. Yet it would be during the apocalyptic conquest of the Indian city of Delhi that Timur forever confirmed not only his tactical genius and invincibility in battle, but also his unlimited appetite for cruelty, when after a 3-day-long raging battle, the undefeated ruler of Central Asia vanquished his foes and set his men loose on the streets of the city, unleashing a bloodthirsty campaign of retribution that was so nightmarish that even 700 years later, it is still remembered as one of the worst fates suffered by any city in history. Born at some time in the late 1320s in what is now Uzbekistan, the man who would one day be called the Emperor of the World had unremarkable origins. His youth was spent on horseback, raiding unfortunate travellers and stealing from farmers, and although he led a small band of followers, he had no real power or position in the world. For much of his life, he was closer to being a bandit chieftain than mighty warlord. While attempting to steal a sheep from a shepherd, he is said to have taken an arrow to the right leg and another through his right hand, cutting off 2 fingers and leaving him with a limp, injuries which resulted in him being given the nickname Timur the Lame, which is the origin of Tamerlane, the name by which he is generally known in the West. Despite these disabilities, in his later life he would embark on a meteoric rise to power, subduing and conquering neighbouring tribes, and eventually growing strong enough to wage war against mighty kingdoms and empires across Asia. Timur claimed to be a descendant of the legendary Genghis Khan, and despite being born 100 years after the Great Khan's death, he saw himself as Genghis Khan's true heir, and dreamed of restoring the Mongol Empire. This was a lofty ambition, however Timur proved to be more than capable. Undefeated in battle, Timur earned a reputation as one of the greatest military leaders in history, crushing foes across Central Asia and even raiding as far afield as Russia, Egypt and India, as he founded a sprawling empire and became the most powerful man in the world. Yet although Timur was one of the most talented warlords in history, he was also one of the most destructive and deadly. His conquests came at an immense cost in human lives, and millions of people would die to make his dream of empire a reality. Some estimates say that as much as 5% of the world's population would perish as a direct result of his wars, and his cruelty to those who dared defy him was unmatched. Across the known world, dozens of grand cities were laid to waste, their buildings burnt to ashes, their wealth plundered, and their populations put to the sword. Any city that refused to immediately yield to his armies would be utterly destroyed. At Damascus in Syria, Baghdad in Iraq, Ryazan in Russia, and Isfahan in Iran, hundreds of thousands of defiant citizens were slaughtered without mercy as Timur demonstrated the fate that awaited those who refused to submit. Timur's terror tactic of choice was to plaster the severed heads of a city's population into giant, gruesome skull towers, with 28 towers containing about 1,500 heads each, said to have been erected outside the Iranian city of Isfahan in 1387, after the city was sacked by his forces. These monuments to his wrath and cruelty would become an all too common sight as Timur's armies carved out a new empire for their master on the smouldering ruins of a dying old world. The sheer industrial scale of slaughter necessary to eliminate so many tens of thousands of people in a single day required each of Timur's soldiers to fulfill a quota of severed heads. Any soldier who failed to meet this quota by the day's end would find his own skull embedded within one of the horrific towers. Trampling civilians under the hooves of his horses, cementing prisoners into the walls of captured cities while they were still alive, or simply burying people alive, were other favoured strategies to instill fear in his enemies, with at one city over 2,000 people said to have been locked in a tower to slowly die of starvation. Yet this seemingly excessive use of cruelty had very real strategic aims. By terrorizing would-be enemies, Timur was able to subdue entire armies and populations without the need for bloodshed, and dozens of cities surrendered without a fight after learning of the terrible fates that befell cities like Isfahan and Baghdad. Timur had built a well-deserved reputation as a man who was not to be trifled with. He didn't make hollow threats. When he demanded obedience, he meant it. However, despite this reputation, there were still those who believed that they could resist the undefeated warlord, whom many were already calling the Emperor of the World. In 1398, Timur turned his attention to Delhi, an ancient Indian city of incredible wealth and power. For centuries, Delhi had been one of the most prosperous cities in the world, and at its height, it encompassed much of modern-day India and Pakistan. This immense wealth had allowed the sultans of Delhi to hire and equip mighty armies, and the Delhi Sultanate was one of the few states in the world to successfully beat back the Mongol invasions. However, by the end of the 14th century, Delhi had fallen on hard times. The Sultanate was being torn apart by a succession dispute as two rival sultans plunged the state into all-out civil war, depleting the state treasury and thinning out its armies. Greatly weakened by this internal strife, Delhi was left highly vulnerable to outside predators. Unfortunately for the people of Delhi, it just so happened that one of history's most ruthless predators was watching the Sultanate's instability with keen interest. In Delhi, Timur saw an opportunity to seize immense amounts of desperately needed loot with minimal effort. Plundered wealth was the fuel which ran his army, and the very lifeblood that kept his empire intact. Timur's men would only continue to follow him and fight, so long as he provided them with new victories and opportunities to line their pockets. For warriors who had come from some of the harshest regions on the planet, it wasn't lofty ideals of empire building or spreading their religion that kept them on the march, but the dream of becoming rich and improving their lot in life. Without new sources of plunder, Timur's army would quickly fragment and disperse as the men sought out new and more lucrative opportunities. Without continuous war, Timur's new empire would fall apart as quickly and violently as it had been built. He wrote to the reigning Sultan of Delhi with his demands, quote, "If the rulers of Hindustan come before me with tribute, I will not interfere with their lives, property or kingdom. But if they are negligent in proffering obedience and submission, I will put forth my strength for the conquest of the kingdoms of India. If they set any value upon their lives, property and reputation, they will pay me a yearly tribute, and if not, they shall hear of my arrival with my powerful armies." The message was clear: submit and pay a yearly tribute, or be destroyed. The dozens of skull towers scattered across the Timurid Empire stood as a testament to Timur's power, the vacant eye sockets of the hundreds of thousands of embedded skulls within, bearing silent witness to the truth of his threat. This was no empty bluff. However, incredibly, the Indian Sultan not only defied Timur, but openly goaded him. Confident that his own army was more than capable of protecting him, the Sultan rebuffed Timur's demands. After all, his people had held off the Mongols over 100 years earlier. Who was this new upstart from the steppes that claimed to be the heir of Genghis Khan? Who was he to make demands of the Sultan of Delhi? His reply to Timur read like an open challenge. "Wrest it from us by force of arms," he dared. "I have numerous armies and formidable elephants, and am quite prepared for war." Echoing the defiance of the ancient Spartans, the Sultan was essentially telling Timur to come and take his wealth by force if he could. Unbeknown to the Sultan at the time, this overconfidence would prove to be a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of his people. When Timur received this unsatisfactory answer, he immediately issued orders for his army to assemble. If the Sultan of Delhi wanted war, he would get one. In 1398, Timur and his host of 90,000 warriors began the long and arduous march from the Timurid capital of Samarkand all the way to Delhi, a more than 1,000-mile journey that would take them across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth, over the towering Hindu Kush mountains that rose 25,000 feet into the heavens, and through dozens of torrential rivers, burning arid deserts, and frost-bitten mountain peaks. As they marched through this unforgiving landscape, Timur and his men were endlessly attacked and harassed by the wild, warlike tribes who inhabited the region's mountain peaks and valleys, fierce warriors that even Alexander the Great had been unable to subdue. Timur was not the kind of man who could tolerate such open defiance. He ordered his men to storm the mountain strongholds, to root out and destroy the clans once and for all. Hundreds perished in fierce fighting atop the roof of the world. However, the tribesmen could not resist Timur's might, no matter how bravely they fought, and the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush were soon stained with their blood, as their open defiance and very existence became a fading memory. With this minor thorn in his side destroyed, Timur resumed the now delayed march on Delhi, plundering the towns and cities of Afghanistan and then India, as his great war machine moved forward relentlessly, sweeping aside all those who tried to stand in his way. Northern India was far more populated than the open steppes and mountain ranges he had recently passed through, and hundreds of thousands were put to the sword as an uncountable number of now long-forgotten villages, towns, and cities were wiped from the face of the earth. A rising human tide of refugees advanced in front of his armies as terrified people abandoned their homes in the face of the unstoppable conqueror, leaving the Indian countryside littered with abandoned ghost towns that seemed to have been frozen in time. As Timur ravaged the land, the Sultan of Delhi could do nothing to stop his foe's advance. He waited impotently behind his city's walls for the arrival of the coming storm, a storm which only months earlier he had dismissed as little more than a passing gale. By December of 1398, Timur's army reached its destination and was poised to strike. His prize was finally within reach. The citizens of Delhi held their breath and prayed for salvation. However, their prayers would go unanswered. Yet all hope was not yet lost. Although Delhi had been greatly weakened by years of civil war and internal division, the Sultan still possessed a formidable army with which to defend his city. 10,000 cavalry, 40,000 infantry, and over 100 war elephants stood ready for battle. Timur's 1,000-mile march across punishing terrain and through hostile territory had taken a great toll on his own forces and reduced his army in size until it was roughly the same in number as the Sultan's. Thousands had been lost to fighting and disease, while thousands more had been left behind to garrison conquered towns and cities. The men who made it all the way to Delhi were by now exhausted, but they stood ready to fight and die under the steely gaze of their emperor. Timur had hoped for a quick and decisive battle, but came prepared for a long and drawn-out siege. However, for reasons that remain unclear, the Sultan of Delhi decided to forego the advantage of his fortified position and march out to meet his enemy on the open field in front of the city. A brief skirmish between both sides' reconnaissance forces resulted in the Indians being beaten back. However, this otherwise insignificant opening clash would have major consequences. As the Delhi army had attacked, Timur observed the more than 100,000 Indian prisoners he had taken so far, rejoicing at the sight of their Indian brothers striking a blow at the invaders. He realized that this massive army of enemy captives within his own camp represented a threat as great as the army of Delhi itself. In the heat of battle, they might rebel, break free and attack his rear, allying themselves with Delhi and trapping his own men in a giant pincer. He decided to take no chances and ordered his men to kill every last prisoner before the main battle started. The order was to be obeyed on pain of death. Each man was to personally slay every Indian prisoner he had taken during the campaign so far, or he himself would be executed in their place and his property given to the informer as a reward. None were exempt, and Timur noted in his diary of the campaign that even a counsellor in his camp, a man of learning who in all his life had never even killed a sparrow, was forced to slay 15 Indian captives with his own sword. By the end of the day, 100,000 lay dead in front of the gates of Delhi, the slaughter said to have been carried out in full view of the Sultan's army, who watched on with horror as their countrymen were butchered like animals. The full details of the main battle that followed are unfortunately now lost to history. However, what is known is that at some point during the fighting, Timur routed the Indian left flank, forcing the Sultan to send in his war elephants in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of battle. Timur's steppe warriors had heard terrifying rumours of these exotic beasts, which were said to have been strong enough to rip a tree out of the ground, smash through thick stone walls, impale men on their razor-sharp tusks, and even tear a man apart with their trunk. Arrows and swords were useless against the thick armour that covered their monstrous bodies, and their tusks are believed to have been coated with poison, so that any injury from them would prove fatal. The elephants carried giant castle-like platforms on their backs, which contained as many as 7 soldiers armed with spears and bows, who could rain down fire upon the enemy from the safety of the high ground, while acting as command units for the rest of their forces. As the colossal beasts charged forward, the ground trembled under their weight, and dread filled the hearts of his brave warriors. However, Timur had made preparations to deal with these mighty instruments of war. He would defeat them using the same tactic he used on so many of his human enemies over the years. He would exploit their fear. Timur had learned that elephants panic easily and fear fire, and so he had ordered his troops to load dozens of camels with as much wood and hay as they could carry. As the elephants approached, Timur ordered his men to ignite the flammable hay and wood that was strapped to the camels' backs, and then drive them towards the more than 100 war elephants that were rapidly bearing down on them. The sight and sound of the flaming camels screeching in pain sent the elephants into a wild panic, causing them to turn around and flee in terror, back the way they came, and straight through the tightly packed Indian lines. As they desperately sought to escape the flaming camels, the elephants stampeded through thousands of their own troops, crushing them beneath their feet, impaling them on their tusks, and throwing them aside with their powerful trunks. Timur wasted no time in taking advantage of the unfolding chaos, and unleashed a final devastating charge that drove what remained of the Indian army into a full-scale retreat. Thousands of fleeing men were cut down as they attempted to flee back to the city, yet although Timur pulled his men back at the last minute to protect them from the archers and ballista positioned along Delhi's wall, it was now clear to the city's authorities that all hope was lost. The battle was over. Now Delhi would have to face Timur's judgment. For the Indians, the battle had been an unmitigated disaster. Their army had been smashed, while the terrified survivors cowered inside the city and awaited Timur's wrath. As the sun set, great shadows cast by mountains of corpses stretched across the ruined battlefield. In capturing the city, Timur had achieved what both Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great could not. The wealth of India was now his for the taking. The next day, Timur officially took possession of the city. The Sultan of Delhi had fled like a thief in the middle of the night, leaving his underlings to handle the business of offering a formal surrender. A great human caravan of councillors, clerks, scholars, and other men of note came out of the city to kneel before Timur, offering their submission and pleading for their lives. Pleas which Timur was happy to accept in exchange for ransom payments so large that most were left penniless, but at least still alive. Such mercy was perhaps unexpected, given the great conqueror's brutal reputation. However, Timur had not come all the way to Delhi merely to destroy. He had come to plunder the city's great wealth, to gather riches that would fuel his great war machine and fund further conquests in other parts of the empire. With the formalities of surrender over, the real business of tallying up and then stealing the great wealth of Delhi began, as Timur's officials snaked across the city in search of every last coin held within. The residents of Delhi breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed as if Timur intended to spare the city's population, despite their blasphemous resistance. Resistance which would normally have seen the heads used as the bricks in one of his fearsome skull towers. However, although the city's surrender and ransom had been agreed peacefully, events were about to spiral out of control. More and more of Timur's soldiers were flowing into the city to carry out the Emperor's orders, requisitioning supplies or dealing with prisoners. However, thousands more entered without permission, either to fill their own pockets with loot, satisfy their curiosity, or satiate their desires. It's unknown exactly what happened next, but it seems as though some kind of disagreement or other nefarious crime inflamed tensions between the city's Indian residents and Timur's men. This single incident unleashed a wave of violence that rapidly engulfed the whole city. The city's population rose up against the foreign occupiers in a series of street battles that were just as ferocious as the main battle for Delhi. One account of the uprising says that after seeing the women disgraced by the occupying soldiers, the Indians set fire to their houses, murdered their own wives and children, and rushed out to fight their enemies to the death, demonstrating incredible boldness and bravery that is said to have shocked even Timur himself. In retaliation for the rebellion, the entire Timurid army flooded into the city, as Delhi was given over to fire and the sword, in a sacking that was shocking even by Timur's dark standards. For 3 days the city became a slaughterhouse, as anyone found within was killed on sight, resulting in another 100,000 Indians killed. The death and desolation was so great that entire streets are said to have been blocked by piles of corpses, as the stench of decomposing flesh hung in the air. If the Indians had initially believed that they might throw the invaders out through force of arms, they quickly learned that the army of Timur was not a body of men, which shied away from extreme violence, and after enduring 3 days of unimaginable bloodshed, they realized that further resistance was futile. Despite still outnumbering the Timurids by as much as 10 to 1, the Indian rebels are said to have fallen into despair and simply given up, perhaps traumatized into a kind of paralysis by the horrors they had witnessed. One account of the rebellion remarks that many of the captured rebels allowed themselves to be slaughtered like sheep without even trying to resist, each kneeling man seemingly resigned to his fate. With the uprising crushed, Delhi was systematically looted and destroyed, as the wealth of one of the richest cities in the world was carted back to the Timurid capital, along with an uncountable number of slaves. Such was the opulence of the treasure contained within the city that thousands of soldiers who had arrived days earlier with nothing more than their swords departed as rich men, marching home at the head of a column of hundreds of personal slaves carrying trunks laden with loot. And even the lowliest Timurid foot soldier is said to have left with at least 20 slaves to do with as he pleased. With their goal achieved, Timur's army left Delhi as abruptly as they had arrived and began the long 1,000-mile journey home, burdened every step of the way by the immense treasures they had seized. The sheer weight and size of the plunder they now carried is said to have slowed their progress to a mere 4 miles per day. The once flourishing city of Delhi was left a husk of its former glory. The magnificent wealth slowly accumulated by generations of Indian sultans had vanished in a matter of days. Buildings lay in smouldering ruins, crops were burned, and the fields lay empty. The few residents who had somehow escaped death or slavery would now have to deal with new disasters, as famine and disease swept through the depopulated streets of the ruined city. Even the water they drank and the air they breathed was contaminated, as the great mass of decaying corpses that littered the city and its surroundings putrefied under the burning sun, and it's said that for the next 2 months, not a bird moved wing in the city. The grim work of clearing out the dead and dismantling the macabre skull towers Timur had constructed now fell to the tiny handful of people still alive, as they began the long and arduous task of rebuilding their lives and their city. So great was the devastation Timur had wrought that it would take over a century for Delhi to recover economically and demographically. However, this was not the end of Timur's legacy. His bloodline would return to torment the city generations later, when his great-great-great-grandson Babur conquered Delhi and founded the Mughal Empire, another titanic land empire that would control much of India for centuries to come. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope to see you again soon.